Hi everyone, it's Joe Veneri, the host of Fit Insider, the show where I talk with the entrepreneurs, executives, and investors who are redefining the business of fitness and wellness. Today I'm joined by Ara Katz, co-founder and co-CEO of Seed Health, a microbial sciences company. In this episode, we discuss the microbiome and the many ways it impacts well-being. Ara explains Seed's approach to building a platform around studying and commercializing probiotics, and we talk about the differences between wellness, healthcare, and consumer life science. A quick reminder before we get into today's show. Every Tuesday, we send a weekly newsletter filled with insights and analysis on the business of fitness and wellness. Join other decision makers and industry operators by subscribing at insider.fit.co. Let's get into it. Hi, Ara. Welcome to Fit Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to today's conversation. And I think as we were just chatting a little bit before we got started, maybe enlighten us to the world of gut health and probiotics and the vast impact that they can have on us. To get started, maybe just introduce yourself and tell us about Seed Health.
Sure. My name is Ara Katz. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Seed Health, and we work in the beautiful invisible world of microbes. And what that means is that we're looking at all kinds of ways of advancing our understanding of how microbes play a role in both human and environmental health, as well as how we can harness the potential of microbes to make a huge impact. And so what that means on the human side is we look at areas where microbes particularly can have an impact on everything from preventive health, things that affect us every day in our daily lives, as well as to really specific conditions and life stages. So microbes across, which on the consumer side looks like probiotics, or when regulated by the FDA, goes through phase trials, are live biotherapeutics, which is basically when a probiotic becomes a drug. And when we look across, gut microbiome, skin microbiome, the oral microbiome, the vaginal microbiome in the case of women's health, urogenital and reproductive health, as well as areas where microbes could be used to develop novel food ingredients and areas where that can be applied for things like infant health, as an example. And then on the environmental side, that also means things like probiotics for honeybees and increasing their immune resistance to things like pesticides, as well as we just announced last week, probiotics for coral reefs to help them be more resistant to rising ocean temperatures, which is a big problem that's causing a lot of the bleaching that we hear about. And in addition to kind of all of that as a brand and the way we kind of show up in the world, we really try and steward a really integrous kind of translation of microbiome and microbes and probiotics. We care deeply about education, and we spend a lot of time and resources on science communication, because I think, as you pointed out when we were starting to talk, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of noise, a lot of hype, a lot of what we say evangelism over the evidence. And we try and be really the stewards of the long game because we know how important this field is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to take that, the noise or hype around just the microbiome and gut health, and then our understanding and evolving understanding of that. And then how you marry that with, we're going to develop a product around this that we bring to market. Can you maybe talk about how you initially came into this space? And then as you think about commercializing this and then pushing further into, clinical validation, like what does that look like from the idea aha moment to maybe we can bring this to market and how we scale it?
Yeah, it's a great question because, I think the reason that there's always been such a church and state in some ways between academia and where some of the greatest science in the world happens and industry is because it's very hard to find that right bridge and that place of alignment. And one of the things that we knew from the very beginning, our aha moment was the microbiome, our understanding of microbes, how we could use them was really this 0 to 1 in health. It was really going to fundamentally and is fundamentally changing the way we understand our bodies, ourselves, pathology, different conditions, why we eat, what we should eat, and really how we're going to make choices every day. It's I always say when people start to understand the microbiome, it's in Minority Report, how there's this way of seeing the world, and all of a sudden you have this almost like the shield in front of you with information. And people tell me all the time, I meditate now and oh my God, I think about my microbiome or my microbes, or every time I look at a menu or if I'm in the grocery store, now I'm like thinking about like not just my human self, but also this microbial self. And of course, how meaningful that is. And so I think we knew our aha moment was not like looking at market data about like the potential and the velocity of like probiotic market share in the world and like the VMS category. It's the microbiome is going to fundamentally change everything we understand and know about human health and biology and how we're going to make choices for our lives. The second part of that was, well, what do you do with that? You can create a brand that educates, that helps create that framework, that helps kind of create that minority report lens so that people can be empowered in the way they think about their daily choices. And you can concurrently look at ways of using microbes to improve human health. And what we understood about, and because we work across, beyond, in and beyond the gut microbiome, is that taking a microbe from IP or discovery in academia, let's say, all the way through commercialization, whether it's a microbe for the skin, a microbe to be applied in the mouth or an oral care, a microbe for vaginal health or curing recurrent urinary tract infections, every microbe, to take that through commercialization goes through essentially the exact same steps. You need to figure out biofermentation. You need to figure out scale up. IP, for example, in microbiome is incredibly nuanced because you can't patent like live organisms. So how do you actually create IP around these things? And so we kind of have built over the years of our platform, which allows us to look at any piece or discovery of IP in microbiome science or related fields and look at how you can take a microbe from that early stage all the way through clinical and then, of course, commercialization. And then, of course, commercialization, that path changes slightly, whether it's going to go through an FDA path, like a regulated path, or whether it's going through an unregulated path.
Yeah, so many different pieces there. And I think the thing from the outside, again, not having nearly the depth of understanding of the microbe and all the impact kind of scientifically, or the knowledge of the company, right, that hopefully we can get into today. If first you look at it and it's like, oh, there are so many other kind of approaches in this space that are wellness oriented or functional nutrition oriented, and there's supplements and all types of different foods, what have you. But I think the thing that is different with Seed is when you start to dig into it, is like it becomes very obvious that this is a platform upon which you can develop all these different applications. And to your point, as you explained it there, like once you understand how to do this, we can do it across all different types of applications. And that's the thing that makes it really interesting. As where things stand today, and then looking ahead to how that develops, what does the current kind of customer offering, product offering look like? And then how do you hope to build on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Today, we only commercialize one product today for humans. We do have a probiotic for honeybees too, and soon to be for coral. Today, it's a product called DSO1, which was our flagship innovation that we've had live in the world since the end of 2018. And it's a 24 strain probiotic and prebiotic formulation, multi-strain, multi-species, which just means that you have multiple strains of the same species, which is unusual in probiotic formulations, as well as a very novel form of a prebiotic. It is offered through a really interesting novel delivery system that we created that puts the inner cap inside of a dry exterior cap, which is the prebiotic. And that is what actually allows it to be both shelf stable, doesn't require refrigeration, but it's also what enables us to have the data that demonstrates 100% survivability through to the end of the small intestine into the colon, which is really novel and unique in the world of probiotics, where a lot of people talk about survivability, but the data is not there. And so that's really our only product today. Where we're heading is into the fields of pediatrics and these other really big categories that I kind of alluded to earlier, where we believe both the science is robust enough and really ready and has gone through those appropriate steps that prepared for commercialization and impact, as well as where we believe like the market is going and where there's receptivity to this kind of science. So looking at oral microbiome, the skin microbiome, as I mentioned, infant health, as well as pediatrics on the probiotic side, and many others, but those are some of the, and of course, vaginal microbiome, because we have a drug trial starting in the fall.
For sure. And with this, a lot of the pieces that we've touched on, kind of weaving them together, you are in selling direct to consumer. There is this I guess it's a tug of war almost with how do we market this with attractive customer acquisition and get to people and catch their attention versus how do we educate consumers and build a brand around being, science backed versus being that catchy Instagram ad. How have you thought about, building this direct to consumer brand that maybe steers away from that wellness or pseudoscience approach? Because it's obvious when you start to look at both the website and the various socials and all the different channels, like that is the approach. Like, how have you thought about that, and how have you gone about adhering to that over time?
Yeah, I mean, so you said it at the very beginning, right? We work in a category, not across all of our fields of science, but particularly with our first product that's incredibly crowded. It's noisy, it's confusing, it's rife with misinformation. In the United States, unlike Europe or Japan, the term probiotic itself is not regulated. So beyond just other probiotic supplementation, there's probiotic pillowcases and kombuchas and kimchis and, chocolate and home cleaning products and tortilla chips. So, for us, we've kind of always developed our own planet, honestly. And I think that that's everything from our lexicon, like our language, which I think is incredibly impactful in how we talk about human health, right? I think one of the things that you can see with climate change and COVID, and we've felt this since the beginning, is, science needs a new publicist, right? Like science needs a serious brand strategist and a real publicist, because the way that science looks, sounds, smells, feels has somehow been in the world correlated with this idea of like big pharma or like medicine in a way that has actually really lost the sense of what science really is, right? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think we really operate from this beautiful quote that Sir Mark Wolpert said. He's the scientific advisor of the UK government. And he said that science isn't finished until it's communicated. And I think it's a beautiful idea that we've always really taken to heart, which is that part of doing science and moving health forward is the responsibility and the accountability. And by the way, the impact that you can create when you educate, when you give people the right language, when you don't, I think things like the fragility of hypes and trends and all this stuff, you're as good as your CAC on Facebook, right? Like, where are you going to be in 5 years if that's the only thing you have to stand on? And look, maybe there's plenty of things that have had positive outcomes. It's like saying that guy in high school that was an asshole is going to finally figure out. And truthfully, a lot of those people go on and have great lives. So I don't want to say that there's no way to not be successful that way. But I'd say that that's not, given the level of scientists that we have that are staking their reputations with us and how seriously we take the stewardship of our field, which does have so much hyperbole around it and so much misinformation. I think we just always triple down on scientific integrity, play the long game with education, play the long game with transparency, and being totally okay to say science doesn't know this yet, but here's some really interesting things that may be true. And to also at the same time say that your personal experience of your body is a relevant, valid data point. And just because science doesn't know something yet doesn't mean that something couldn't be true for you. And I think that very rarely do you have anyone that tolerates nuance or duality, which is, I think, our biggest problem in the world, by the way. But I think so I think you can either be as good as your last Instagram ad that performed well, which, by the way, we do and we participate. But I think you'll find that we try and approach those things, I think, in a meaningfully different way. And I'm happy to speak about any of that.
Yeah, I think it's there's a couple things in there I'd like to maybe dig into. One being, I think the approach and looking long-term and leaning into science and almost rebranding it in a way is very well said and important. At the same time, there is, some type of expectation that whether it's the ads or the channels or even the consumer product performs. And so to the extent that you're able to talk about any metrics that matter, how is that offering working? How are you going about acquiring users? And then how is it playing out in terms of retention, them coming back and building that consumer offering? And then, yeah, definitely a couple of questions kind of building on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you KOLs, for example, influencers, which I think I think a lot of people at this point realize that whether it's a practitioner and a gastroenterologist or someone with 1 million followers, everyone is an in this way, right? And the way that we went about our influencer work and our KOL work was really interesting. So we decided that instead of saying like, we're just not going to do that, we took the opportunity to say, okay, if we lead with education, if we can use this channel to get better information out there, even if it doesn't lead to a lot of sales, at least we will have lived the value system that we really hope to impart, even if you just nudge it a little bit, to influencers about how we wish more brands showed up in the world. So we launched Seed University. We've won a lot of awards for this, by the way, and nobody can get their share sale links or access any of their codes unless they pass Seed University 100% in the final exam. It takes about an hour. It's not crazy. It actually was built natively on Instagram. So you can go to the account Seed University and you can go through the entire course through the highlight reels. And then you click through at the end and you go to the final exam. And what we do consistently, and then every year, everybody, to be able to, in addition to that, you pledge and sign a pledge of accountability. And then within every post, you use #accountable. And that was our way of saying, could we use influencers also as a vehicle for signaling how much we wish there were more accountability on a channel that, and of course in our category where there is so much misinformation and noise. And so instead of saying, oh, just stay away from it because it's such bullshit and there's too much bullshit out there, actually, could you use kind of what Marshall McLuhan said in the 70s, which is like the medium is the message. So could you use these mediums that are being used for misinformation to actually then disseminate better education and better information? And today that rivals Facebook and Instagram and Google as a top channel for us for revenue. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that you actually can't just promiscuously go on share sale and like just grab links and start posting, which I just don't think is how we invest really in these partnerships and long tail of what's going to be the most meaningful for the business.
Yeah, super interesting. And a lot of times, especially when you talk about going the influencer route, that's either completely outsourced and somebody hands off a brief and then they go about getting people to post about it and you just kind of see it on the back end. Or folks, it's, I don't want to say rushed, but not as intentional. And so you don't get this, especially from the impact on understanding the intricacies of the product to advance the brand in a meaningful way. So yeah, I think winning awards for that, rightfully so. With that, as you think about, in my mind, as we're talking about all these different things and the various approaches that you've taken to it, is this about gut health or probiotics or nutrition or, skin, all the different applications? And even a step further, you start to see different research around the impact on mental health, the impact on athletic performance, the impact on pediatrics and children, to your point. How do you, think through all this to say, oh, these are the paths that we're going to pursue. This is how we're going to tackle it. This is how we define success, right? This is the outcomes that we're seeking. You kind of talk us through your thought process and how you think, oh, this is the route that we're going to take to solving a particular problem.
I'll give you the very boring answer, which is that it has to be outstanding breakthrough science. And that is really like our compass. Like for the last, don't get me wrong, like we have so many people that throw IP at us all day. And if I wanted to show you a shelf of 27 different probiotics for different conditions from our, osteoporosis to like weight loss, we easily could have just SKU proliferated all day using the brand value we've built and just thrown up a bunch of stuff over the last years that all, by the way, have some clinical research to them in some cases. So it's not even like there's no clinical work, but it's not clinical work that passed any of our diligence. And so we're about to make 3 announcements in the next 6 months that I think really demonstrate where we're headed in different of these areas, some of which you mentioned. I think the greatest example would be our work in vaginal microbiome as an example. We really, or in our work that we're going to announce soon in gut brain, we've waited. There's so many low-hanging fruit we could have grabbed in the last few years. And we were lukewarm on it. We knew our community would buy it from us. We knew it was meaningful and would have a lot of market fit in terms of where the consumer is. We knew that we probably could have dressed it up, right, into something that could have felt a little more meaningful. But we just kind of, again, I can't stress enough, we just play the long game wherever we can. And I think that I'm so grateful that we do, because the things that are now on our plate and that we're going to be announcing in the next 6 months are truly mic drops in the microbiome world. that I think squarely demonstrate, I think, our commitment to that integrity and that life science rigor.
Yeah, to that point, and I don't know all the ins and outs, so you can kind of correct me, but I know there's kind of FDA trials that you all are involved in and have started. And I've talked to other operators and founders in the broader digital health landscape. Some of them have said, we're not going to go that route because it is so time consuming. It's so costly that we think we can go out and make an impact by going direct to consumer and staying in this, maybe not FDA approved or not an approved medical device or medical treatment. And then there's others that said, we're going to go and basically be in stealth until we get this digital therapeutic or prescription or approval signed off on. How do you think about, is there like a separation between what will become the consumer business? Does this go the healthcare route? Is it going to be prescribed? How do you walk the line between the wellness and healthcare?
Well, we don't see consumer health as wellness. Like, I think we prefer to think about it. There's like a new term that we really like that I think really articulates where this world is heading, is that there'll be wellness, there'll be healthcare, and there'll be this kind of world of consumer life science, which is kind of what we really like. And I think that feels the most like appropriate, right? Which is, it's not misleading from a FDA regulatory perspective. For us, we do both. And there's lots of rationale that goes into why we would do both. And which thing goes the regulated route. I'll give you like actually a perfect example. DS-01, which is our current daily symbiotic, is available from a consumer perspective today, D2C, as you mentioned. We did not set out to study with DS-01, IBS, IBD, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, really any of those like really complex under like autoimmune microbiome correlated kind of, gastrointestinal conditions and diseases. What happened is that after we launched, we started getting all kinds of anecdotal feedback from people that suffered from Crohn's, UC, IBS, IBD, in all forms, IBS, and there's kind of different levels of symptomology associated with each of those. And they started saying, like, this is the only thing that's ever helped me. So of course we can't make any claims. We can't say anything about that. I wish we could. Granted, maybe other companies or brands would. We can't do anything about that except investigate it. And so what we did was we were authorized by the FDA with an IND with Dr. Anthony Lembo at Harvard Medical School to initiate an IBS trial, looking at how DS-01 could impact people with IBS, as well as further characterizing the role that the microbiome may play in IBS. So we kind of were able to both move science forward as well as further our understanding of like DS-01. So that trial is underway today. So that's a great example where you have something that was actually started from a consumer perspective, but may actually have some applicability from a regulated perspective for a very specific condition. And we'll see what happens. But that's a great example of where, like, I think if you have the DNA where you actually have the life science underlying platform and the ability to do both, I think you have to say is, where are you going to have the greatest impact? And I think, like, for example, there's areas of women's health that we know will have the greatest impact going through regulated and a prescription because of how prevalent some of these things are and how much adoption we would need from the healthcare systems, and how burdensome things like preterm birth is $22 billion burden on the American healthcare system, not to mention how many women, and particularly disproportionately communities of color, are impacted by preterm birth. That's not something where you just want to like D2C sell something for preterm birth. That's where like you could actually make a huge difference in healthcare if you go that regulated path, but it takes longer.
For sure. But that also goes back to the, building the platform around this, leading with the education, the science-backed approach, and then kind of following these different leads and pulling the thread to take you to this particular use case in which you can scale up and whatever the application that makes sense for, that particular issue and also the opportunity. And I think maybe zooming out a little bit and down that path, again, back to the point around like, there's so many different applications for, if you're calling them even consumer life sciences and digital health, direct to consumer healthcare. And we've even seen around gut health and personalized nutrition, there's, some digital therapeutics around behavior change and telehealth that are working with people with specific conditions. There's at-home tests and diagnostics. Do you look at this and think, will all of those things be standalone different products and services that people will have to, kind of jump through the different hoops to use and see what best works for them? Or do you see Seed Health being in this position where some of that gets integrated into the offering, where you give them this end-to-end experience and can kind of take them through that whole journey?
It's a great question. I think that there's look, diagnostics and a lot of the personalization falls to us very much in that category of evangelism, way ahead of evidence. And there may be certain categories where I don't even know. And I think where a lot of people, again, why language is so important, most personalization today just means customization. Like if you want to say that you take a blood test and it shows you that you're deficient in vitamin D, and then someone tells you to eat more things with vitamin D and you call that personalization, like, I don't know. What I will say is that enough of these companies are charging people to pay them to build large data sets. And I think in the future, those data sets will be very important. I don't know if they have the applicability today that they sell, all of them. And I sometimes also, one of the things that and you see this with cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is like, I will sound like a cynic, but I'm also like, there's a positive and a negative to this, which is, I believe sometimes that those things are just as impactful because of the feedback loops. And so I don't even know sometimes if it matters if it's science as much as what I feel. And I see this with CBD, with CBT. We see this with other like areas, particularly with weight loss, when there's accountability, when there's someone there to talk to. You see this in why I think functional medicine is sometimes more impactful than regular healthcare, not because I think that they know everything either. And sometimes I don't always agree with all of these methodologies, but what I do know is that they touch people more often. Their visits are almost 4x longer. I know that those are people that are typically not stressed in the healthcare system of seeing patients and mired in insurance paperwork. So there's so many like factors as to why I think some of these like digital interventions are so meaningful. And some of it is literally just the human piece of it, which is accountability, compliance, like, that sense that something's for you, which I think for so many people who feel so lost and disenfranchised by the healthcare system, that in itself is healing and helpful. They take stress out of it. There's more touch points with it. Like, I think there's so many things that haven't really been studied and unraveled beyond whether or not you can send in a blood sample and like know everything about your health today. Now, as those data sets that everybody's paying for today get bigger, there probably is a moment where some of them, and particularly as medical records increasingly are digitized, there's probably a lot of really interesting work that's going to happen where those services will start to actually be very meaningful. I just don't know if we're like there yet.
Yeah, I think it's tough, especially, you can even extend that to different wearable devices. It's like, yes, lots of people are using them. Yes, they're paying lots of money for the hardware and the device itself, and then subscriptions that go along with it. Is it working? Does it tell us what to do? Does it provide that, feedback to people eventually take them off? Like, yes. But Does it help other people? Like, yes. So how does that fit in? And I think we will start to see these, whether it's through consolidation or just different partnerships or outright the data sets, like this start to get closer to truly personalized solutions in a meaningful way, as opposed to siloed or, part of the way there as it might be now.
In physics, there's something called the observational effect, right? Which is the idea that the thing you're observing changes just by being observed. And so, and then there's placebo effect. And then there's, there's just so many. Human health is so complex, right? Like, and I think that, we like to think of it today. And again, like we're always looking and thinking about what personalization and what diagnostics could look like. And there's certain areas of microbiome where diagnostics may actually be incredibly helpful. Saliva, vaginal microbiome. There's a lot of areas where I think we could, that will be in areas that we're working on. But I do really think that in sometimes I don't know I still think that these things, even when science is lacking, can sometimes be really impactful. The question is, when it's lacking, is compliance possible? And will people really stick with something for a while if it's not super effective? And I think there's, as again, like so many factors that go into that too.
Yeah, there's so many factors, so much so that unfortunately we probably won't solve it here today. But certainly chipping away at it as we get towards the end of the conversation. It's certainly been a busy year for you at Seed Health. The company raised a $40 million funding round in the spring, I believe. And I think earlier this year, or maybe it was later last year, acquired Augie, which is a digital health company. Maybe just talk about what those kind of benchmarks, milestones mean for the company and your goals as you think about the roadmap and where you want to go from here.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. I think one was, speaking of what we were just talking about with digital, right? Like the AI company that we acquired, we actually helped train that AI through a really large citizen science initiative called Give a Shit. And now the AI is probably about 96% accuracy in terms of being able to like characterize poop off of like a mobile phone image. And so that's really kind of like an underlying technology that we're thinking about as we think about building some of the feedback loops, right? As we think about digitizing part of the experience of our product. And I think a lot of our early digital health work will probably be thinking about the augmentation of the experience of a lot of our physical products, which is really, I think, one of the areas that I think you're going to start to see a lot more of, which is this combinatorial idea of like the digital plus the physical. And then I think there's the funding really, I mean, honestly is probably not surprisingly really for the expansion of the clinical work and the rollout of our platform that we've been developing for, 4 years. And so like there's a lot of products that have been in R&D for a while that we're just kind of getting ready for rollout. And so I think that as those become ready, I think really it was the capital to be able to both expand the team, really to get prepared for some of these launches, to expand our clinical work and to expand internationally.
For sure. And I think so many things, and I think maybe I've asked the question in different ways and thinking about the best way to pose it as we wrap up, which is, how do you, whether it's through the second half of the year, call it 6 months, or early into next year, or maybe even longer term, think about the benchmarks and milestones that achieving these things will mean success, or maybe not hitting these milestones will mean you've somehow come up short. How do you think about that with the team? How do you then prioritize those things, and what does that look like roadmap wise?
I mean, just in terms of our big priorities?
Yeah, it's again, this is probably because both my lack of understanding of the particular category and trying to wrap my head around all the different applications, and also what it seems like the massive opportunity in front of you for the various applications that, as you think about putting this down on whether it's priorities or even things that you're excited about, as you think like, now we're going to start to roll these things out and this is what's top of mind as we get into the back half of the year. How do you think about those things? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are dictated by the timelines of our clinical research, right? Because that's probably the longest period. There's two things that take the longest period of time for us: the development of the delivery technologies and the packaging, which for today is not as relevant. For like our future categories is very relevant. And and particularly because we work with and seek out some of like the most interesting, like newer, like biomaterials, which a lot of them are really like actually take longer, because when you're the first to like injection mold the material, like it takes a second to kind of figure that out. And then I think the second is the clinical research, which is not an area you want to skimp on. And if you want to really have the appropriate like microbiome data, the appropriate metabolomics, you want to do all the, you prepare for, and then of course waiting for publication, which can take 3 or 4 months itself, even once the trial is finished and you've submitted. And so I think that a lot of our timelines are kind of always this like culmination of or reconciliation of market insights and data and understanding like what we think we could launch next in terms of what feels like the right cadence of products. The second is really whether or not it will be ready, which I hate to say is like a shitty answer, but it's really true, which is like, would it be ready according to our standards, right? Not the like shove it out the door because we found a contract manufacturer to slap a label on something and then use their structure function claims, which is kind of like how a lot of things work. And so I think it really does depend on what it is. But for the most part, like those two things are the longest lead time. Once we've identified a piece of IP and once we've started that translational work and we've identified like what the product is, it really is like clinical work on a lot of the industrial design pieces.
Yeah, I feel it's so interesting. So many moving parts. I feel like I could ask a million more questions, but just want to be, keep an eye on the time. I think that's potentially a good place to wrap up, given that it's such a good primer both into the category and science around the microbiome and probiotics and the platform that you're building, and then extending that into the kind of future and potential of Seed Health. So with that, I think folks will probably have a lot of questions and want to learn more. What's the best place? Where do we want to direct them? What would you have them check out? Just tell them how to follow along.
If you want the big picture vision, seedhealth.com. If you'd like to see the expression of, I think, a lot of the things I talked about today around our product and our brand, seed.com. And if you want to just learn something every day, at Seed on Instagram.
Perfect. I definitely encourage folks to check that out, and super grateful that you made a few minutes to chat with us today, and really looking forward to sharing this conversation with the listeners.
Thank you. Thanks for all your questions.
Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. For more from Fit Insider, visit insider.fit.co and subscribe to our weekly newsletter for insights and analysis on the business of fitness and wellness. Then go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. See you next time.